Deep in the humid heart of Southeast Asia, where the air hung heavy with the scent of blooming campa flowers and the cries of macaques echoed from the trees, a vision stirred in the mind of a king. Suryavarman II, ruler of the Khmer Empire in the early 12th century, stood atop a hill looking out over a vast, lush landscape. His gaze wasn't on what was, but on what could be. His kingdom stretched farther than any Southeast Asian empire had before, from the coasts of present-day Vietnam to the edges of Burma. But the king wanted more than land. He wanted to touch eternity. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the insects fell silent, Suryavarman claimed he saw Vishnu, the preserver, bathed in gold light, guiding him toward a place that would unite heaven and earth. Not a palace. Not a monument to vanity. But a temple for the gods themselves to walk among mortals. That vision, whether dream or divine inspiration, took root in his heart and refused to fade. What followed was one of the most ambitious building projects in human history. Angkor Wat wasn't built overnight, or even within a decade. But the seed was planted when the king gathered his royal architects, astrologers, and priests beneath a canopy of banana leaves and stars. He spoke not of towers and walls, but of cosmic alignment, sacred proportions, and immortality carved in stone. The temple would face west, unusual for Khmer temples, because it was to honor Vishnu and symbolize death, rebirth, and the eternal cycle. But before the ground could be broken, there were signs to read, stars to study. The high priest consulted the nakshatra, lunar mansions from Indian astrology, calculating auspicious dates. The sacred measurements were derived from Hindu cosmology, the mountain of Meru, the surrounding oceans, and the heavens beyond. The temple would be a microcosm of the universe itself, laid out with mathematical precision. The chosen site was no random patch of forest. It was a place long rumored to have powerful ley lines, rich soil, and proximity to the ancient capital of Yesodharapura. But it was also remote, heavily forested, and crawling with wildlife. The king's entourage, elephants in tow, hacked through dense undergrowth while astrologers planted stakes and marked coordinates, guided as much by ritual as by geography. Then came the royal decree: construction was to begin. The first offerings were made. Flowers, rice, bloodless animal sacrifices, and chants filled the humid air. This wasn't just a groundbreaking. It was a cosmic invocation. The king himself, adorned in gold and lapis, dipped his hand into the soil and whispered a prayer to Vishnu. Soon, the forest echoed with the rhythm of tools, the creak of ox-drawn carts, and the songs of stoneworkers. Camps sprang up around the clearing, as laborers arrived from every corner of the empire. Some paid, some pledged, some pressed into service. Brickmakers from the Mekong, carpenters from distant Laotian provinces, and sandstone sculptors from Kulin Mountain arrived with their families and their gods. And the king watched it all from a temporary pavilion, fingers tapping against the hilt of a ceremonial sword. This wasn't just construction, it was a declaration to the world and the heavens that the Khmer Empire was not only powerful, but eternal. What most didn't know was that Suryavarman II was racing against time. The omens were mixed, and the empire, though vast, was not immune to internal strife. There were murmurs of rebellion in the north, of disease along the trade routes. But the king remained resolute. The temple must be finished, or at least begun, in his lifetime. He wanted his ashes buried beneath its highest tower, his soul carried to Vishnu on a beam of light. So, with blessings whispered into the stone, and an empire's hopes chiseled into every block, the great work began. And far to the north, in the sacred mountains, the stone itself began to stir. From the highlands of Phnom Kulin, where waterfalls tumbled like silver ribbons through the dense jungle, the sandstone waited. It had been formed over millions of years, compressed grains of ancient seabeds hardened into golden blocks. Now, under the Khmer king's command, it was to be reborn as Angkor Wat. But stone does not move itself. The first challenge in constructing the temple wasn't spiritual, it was logistical. How do you move more than 5 million tons of stone nearly 50 kilometers through rugged terrain, jungle, and rivers? For the Khmer, the answer lay not in brute force alone, but in brilliance. They began at the Kulin quarries, where skilled teams, many of them hereditary stone cutters, traced natural fault lines in the rock. With iron chisels and wooden mallets, they coaxed enormous blocks from the mountain face, working with rhythm and ritual. Each cut had to be precise. Imperfect blocks were discarded without regret. It wasn't just about mass, it was about harmony. Once freed, the blocks were dragged, yes, dragged, across temporary bamboo tracks or lashed to giant wooden sleds. Oxen teams, often dozens at a time, groaned under the strain as the cargo inched toward navigable rivers. But the Khmer were nothing if not resourceful. They built wooden ramps, reinforced bridges, and even carved channels through dense undergrowth. Every obstacle was answered with an innovation. Then came the water. At a time when many civilizations struggled with road building, the Khmer mastered hydraulic logistics. The great rivers of Cambodia, particularly the Siem Reap River, became aquatic highways. During the rainy season, when roads turned to mud and spirits soured, the rivers swelled and beckoned. The blocks were loaded onto rafts, often strapped together from bamboo and palm trunks, and floated downstream toward the construction site. It wasn't as simple as letting the current do the work. The rivers twisted like serpents through the jungle, and the risk of capsizing was high. Teams of boatmen guided the makeshift barges with long poles and paddles, chanting mantras to calm the water spirits. Along the banks, watchtowers and signal fires coordinated traffic like an ancient version of air traffic control. When a raft arrived at the Angkor site, drums were beaten to alert the receiving crews. Unloading the stone was an art form of its own. The rafts were guided into carved channels that slowed the flow and brought the precious cargo right to the temple's edge. From there, elephants, trained for years in hauling and balance, took over. They would trudge up earthen ramps, pulling block after block to waiting masons. But the stone's journey was far from over. Each block had to be smoothed, measured, and fitted with uncanny precision. The Khmer used no mortar. The weight and placement of the stones held the temple together. A mistake meant starting again. So master masons marked every piece in Sanskrit or numeric scripts, leaving behind a code that modern archaeologists still decipher today. Even as stones arrived in an endless parade, the supply chain never ceased. Trees were felled for scaffolding, bricks were baked in kilns for supporting structures, and vast quantities of rice were cultivated to feed the thousands working on site. The empire didn't just build a temple, it transformed its landscape into a living machine, pulsing with purpose and belief. One of the most remarkable feats of this operation was its lack of wheels. Despite having the knowledge, the Khmer avoided carts because wheels sank in the wet ground. Instead, they relied on manpower, sledges, and beasts. It may seem primitive, but it worked. Millions of blocks, each weighing up to 1.5 tons, arrived with astonishing regularity. As the years passed, the temple began to rise from the jungle like a mountain forged by human will. The towers, meant to mimic Mount Meru, pierced the sky. Galleries stretched outward like cosmic arms, enclosing courtyards and sanctuaries. All of it built from that same golden stone, born in Kulin and baptized in sweat. And yet, every stone told a story, not just of geology or labor, but of faith. Many believed that the stone itself held spiritual memory, that carving it was akin to awakening a sleeping god. So each piece was not just handled, it was honored. By the time the central causeway was laid, a massive sandstone path over 300 meters long, there were workers who had spent half their lives on the project. Some never saw the temple complete, but that didn't matter. They believed they were carving their names into eternity, one block at a time. And as the sun set over Angkor, casting long shadows over scaffolds and stones, the king's vision edged closer to reality. The temple wasn't just being built. It was being summoned. At the center of the growing stone labyrinth, where towers now reached skyward and shadows danced in the colonnades, the soul of Angkor Wat took form, not in materials, but in people. An empire of builders had converged, drawn by duty, devotion, and in many cases, no choice at all. The Khmer workforce was immense and intricately organized. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands toiled at Angkor Wat during its peak years of construction. Each day, the temple complex echoed with the steady thud of hammers, the whisper of chisels over stone, and the calls of foremen coordinating the controlled chaos. This was no unruly mass. It was a living organism, with roles so finely tuned they might rival the divisions of a modern factory. There were the masons, whose hands were thick and calloused from shaping sandstone into blocks that fit together tighter than puzzle pieces. There were carpenters who built the wooden frames and scaffolds, some reaching dizzying heights. Blacksmiths kept a constant supply of chisels and tools. And then there were the true artists, the sculptors. These artisans weren't just stone carvers. They were storytellers, historians, and theologians all in one. Under the guidance of Brahmin priests and royal architects, they began the monumental task of carving miles of bas-reliefs into the temple walls, images of gods, demons, battles, and daily life. The most iconic of these is the churning of the ocean of milk, a swirling saga of immortality etched into stone. Serpents, devas, and asuras seem to move along the wall even in stillness, brought to life by the rhythm of the chisel and the precision of divine geometry. But even more fascinating than the carvings themselves is how they were organized. Like a script from a celestial play, every figure's size, pose, and gaze was measured against strict religious codes. An arm too long, a gaze out of alignment, it could disrupt the harmony and require the panel to be redone. Perfection wasn't a preference. It was law. Overseeing this enormous operation were master architects, many of whom were considered semi-divine themselves. They carried not blueprints, but palm leaf manuscripts with sacred diagrams, formulas, and mythological correspondences. Construction wasn't merely about structure, it was about cosmology. The towers had to reflect the peaks of Mount Meru. The moats represented the encircling cosmic ocean. Everything had meaning. And yet, for all its sacred purpose, the temple was also a city of labor. Families lived in sprawling camps around the site. Children played in the dust while their parents carved gods. Women prepared meals for the crews and helped haul water from nearby reservoirs. Monks performed rituals at dawn, priests burned incense, and doctors tended to injured workers using herbal poultices and chants. The king himself visited regularly, often in procession. Riding atop an elephant adorned in silk, he would stop to survey progress, bless the workers, or listen to the prayers of the priests. To many, his presence was more than royal, it was divine. After all, Suryavarman II had declared Angkor Wat a temple mausoleum, a house of gods and his future resting place. The energy was infectious. Even neighboring kingdoms sent emissaries to witness the spectacle. Traders from India, China, and the Malay world passed through, exchanging goods and tales of a city where gods were being born from stone. And in the court of the king, poets wrote verses comparing the growing temple to the home of the gods themselves, as if Vishnu had descended to earth. At night, the temple did not sleep. Under moonlight, torchbearers moved through the galleries, checking the integrity of new walls or guarding sacred materials. Chants echoed into the forest, mingling with the cries of night birds and distant drums. It was as if the temple had a heartbeat, felt by every soul within miles. Yet despite the scale, construction moved with astonishing speed. Thanks to the vast labor force and disciplined planning, major portions of Angkor Wat were completed within the lifetime of Suryavarman II, a feat as awe-inspiring as the temple itself. But completion didn't mean the end. Once the main structure stood, it was time to infuse it with spirit. Rituals were held to awaken the temple's sacred energy. Priests anointed the central tower with holy water and saffron paste. Gold leaf statues of Vishnu were installed in sanctuaries. Sacred fires were lit, and for days the temple rang with conch shells, gongs, and the rhythmic hum of Sanskrit mantras. And so, what had begun as a vision in the jungle now stood as the embodiment of divine order on earth, a monument not just to a king or a god, but to a people who believed they were building the very axis of the cosmos. Beneath the elegance of Angkor Wat's lotus-shaped towers and divine galleries lay a foundation of astonishing complexity, an invisible architecture of earth, water, and engineering that made the impossible endure. The Khmer Empire didn't just build upward, it built downward, outward, and across vast stretches of land. The true genius of Angkor Wat wasn't only in its carvings or symbolism. It was in its hydraulic engineering, a system so advanced that modern scientists only began to grasp its scale with the help of satellite imaging centuries later. Before the first stone was laid, the land itself had to be tamed. The temple's site was chosen not just for spiritual reasons, but because it allowed the Khmer to manipulate the surrounding water with precision. This wasn't simply a matter of digging a moat, it was the crafting of a living, breathing hydraulic organism. Angkor Wat sits within a massive rectangular enclosure bordered by a moat nearly 200 meters wide and over 5 kilometers long. At first glance, it resembles a decorative feature. But this was no idle aesthetic choice. The moat served to stabilize the soil beneath the temple, preventing the massive weight of the stone from sinking into the soft floodplain. It also acted as a reservoir, regulating water levels during Cambodia's intensely seasonal climate. Beneath the temple itself, a hidden grid of sand and laterite was arranged in layers, each carefully selected for its ability to filter and absorb water, providing a sort of sponge beneath the structure. This system reduced subsidence and protected against earthquakes, floods, and erosion. Even the soil around the temple was adjusted, shifted, or replaced to ensure optimal drainage. But the moat was only the beginning. The builders created an entire network of canals, spillways, dikes, and reservoirs, connecting Angkor Wat to the broader Angkorian water system. The nearby barays, massive artificial lakes such as the West Baray, held millions of cubic meters of water. These weren't just water tanks. They were symbols of cosmic oceans and also functioned as year-round irrigation sources. In dry seasons, the canals could feed rice fields and orchards. During monsoons, they diverted floodwaters away from the temple. In this way, Angkor Wat didn't sit on a landscape. It was the landscape, woven into a system that turned water into both protector and provider. And this water logic extended into the daily life of the temple. Sacred ponds were placed near sanctuaries for ritual bathing. Drainage systems beneath the courtyards allowed rain to flow smoothly without damaging the stone. Even the positioning of the central sanctuary, on a slightly raised terrace, was calculated to keep it above water levels, making it appear to rise above the world, untouched. None of this happened by accident. The Khmer engineers and priests worked together, blending spiritual cosmology with empirical observation. They understood soil mechanics, hydrodynamics, and celestial alignments in ways that would impress even modern engineers. The temple's axis was aligned with the equinox sunrise, allowing sunlight to pierce the main gate and travel deep into the sanctum on precise days of the year. The balance of the heavens was matched by the flow of the waters. All of this, built without steel, concrete, or computers, just brilliance, bamboo, and belief. And yet, such feats came at a cost. The labor required to dig moats, redirect rivers, and construct giant embankments was staggering. Slaves, soldiers, and peasants worked alongside master engineers, often submerged knee-deep in mud, suffering from leeches, fever, and exhaustion. But to many, it was a holy act. To shape the land was to shape one's karma. One engineer, whose name is lost but whose markings remain etched into a laterite block, was said to whisper to the earth as he dug, "Let the water remember us." And it did. To this day, after 1,000 years, the canals still guide rainfall around Angkor Wat with graceful efficiency. As the temple rose higher, so too did its reflections, in the moat, in the barays, and the flooded rice fields beyond. These mirrored images were no accident. Reflection was built into the very fabric of the temple. In the beliefs of the time, the seen and the unseen coexisted. What was above should be echoed below. Heaven and earth were twins, and the waters made sure they never forgot each other. By the time the temple's last foundation stones were laid, Angkor Wat was more than a marvel of architecture. It was a self-sustaining system, a feat of environmental harmony and monumental ambition. And every stone above rested on the quiet genius of what lay beneath. As the final stones settled into place and the scent of sandalwood wafted through the sanctuaries, Angkor Wat awakened. It was no longer just an architectural masterpiece. It had become a living, breathing temple, pulsing with rituals, symbolism, and divine energy. The air around it shifted. Visitors felt it. Birds circled its towers differently. Monks said prayers there echoed longer, as if the gods themselves were listening more closely. The soul of Angkor Wat lived in its carvings, in the ceremonies, and in the eternal dialogue between stone and sky. Every wall, every doorway, every corridor was more than just structure, it was scripture. The bas-reliefs told stories that extended hundreds of meters, wrapping around the galleries like an endless prayer. There was Rama battling Ravana, Vishnu striding across the ocean, and Suryavarman II himself seated on a divine throne, receiving tribute from distant lands. These scenes were not frozen, they moved with the sun. As daylight crept across the carvings, shadows gave the figures life, a slow, silent procession unfolding each day. Within the inner sanctum, the heartbeat of the temple pulsed in sacred silence. At its core stood a towering central spire, representing Mount Meru, the cosmic axis of the universe. Only the holiest of priests could ascend to the inner sanctum's peak, where once a golden statue of Vishnu gleamed under rays of filtered sunlight. Pilgrims, barefoot and reverent, would climb the steep terraces, each level a metaphysical step closer to enlightenment. And the rituals, oh, the rituals were everything. Every morning, smoke curled from incense bowls as priests welcomed the day with Sanskrit chants, and the soft ringing of bronze bells. Offerings of jasmine, coconuts, and rice were laid on stone altars. Sacred dancers, the apsaras, adorned in golden crowns and flowing silks, would perform movements passed down for generations, each gesture a cosmic message, a retelling of creation myths choreographed into graceful arcs. The entire layout of Angkor Wat worked as a sacred machine. As the equinox sun rose, it aligned perfectly with the central tower, casting light deep into the sanctuary's heart. On certain days, this beam illuminated the deity within, a celestial spotlight revealing the divine presence. It wasn't just astronomical genius. It was theater. It was magic. And it was faith rendered in stone and sun. Even outside of major ceremonies, life within the temple was vibrant. Pilgrims traveled from across the empire to see the murals and receive blessings. Scholars debated theology in shaded courtyards. Musicians played bamboo flutes and two-string tiaro instruments near sacred pools, where monks bathed before prayer. It was said that even silence inside Angkor Wat had a music to it. The walls themselves seemed to shimmer with intention. Each apsara, there are over 1,700 carved into the stone, was unique. Some smiled coyly, others stared boldly, adorned with different headdresses and jewelry. They weren't decoration. They were the soul of the temple made visible, women of the celestial realm guarding the spiritual balance of the space. Visitors were often overwhelmed, not by scale alone, but by presence. The symmetry was intoxicating. The way one could stand in a hallway and see endless columns fade into the horizon, it pulled the mind outward while simultaneously drawing the soul inward. Travelers described feeling smaller but also more connected, as if they'd stepped into a bridge between heaven and earth. It's no surprise that Angkor Wat soon became more than a temple. It became the center of the Khmer world. It featured on currency, in royal proclamations, and in court poetry. Suryavarman II had envisioned it as his eternal resting place, and now, in every way that mattered, his soul had been absorbed into the stone. And yet, even as the temple thrived, its vibrancy required constant tending. Monks swept leaves from the corridors at dawn. Craftsmen repaired carvings worn by rain. Priests passed knowledge to younger disciples, who memorized hymns and rituals not with paper, but with repetition, rhythm, and reverence. For a time, it seemed Angkor Wat would never fall. Its foundations were strong, its symbolism deep, its presence unmatched. But even the most sacred flame can flicker in the wind. Clouds were beginning to gather beyond the horizon. Trade routes were shifting. Rival powers were rising. And deep within the forests of Cambodia, the jungle never forgot its claim. Still, for now, Angkor Wat glowed, alive with purpose, shimmering in its golden sandstone, crowned in spiritual glory. The gods, it seemed, had truly found a home on earth. The dawn that broke over Angkor Wat in the years after its completion was not the same radiant sunrise it had known in Suryavarman II's reign. The great king was gone, his ashes entombed in the sanctum as he had wished, and his temple stood, a silent sentinel to his ambition. But empires, like temples, are never immune to time. The Khmer Empire began to fray at its edges. Successors fought over thrones with more ambition than wisdom. The delicate systems that had supported the grandeur, agriculture, infrastructure, tribute, began to strain. The mighty berets, once miracles of water management, silted up. Canal walls cracked. Without constant care, the hydraulic heartbeat of Angkor faltered, and when the waters grew still, so did the empire's strength. Foreign pressures added weight to the cracks. Thai kingdoms from the west, like Ayutthaya, gained power and began pressing in. Trade routes once dominated by the Khmer were overtaken by maritime powers who favored coastal ports over inland capitals. The temple, still shining in stone, now stood in a slowly dimming world. Yet through it all, Angkor Wat remained. Other temples fell to ruin, but Angkor endured. While kings moved capitals and wars reshaped maps, this temple mausoleum held its ground. Its moats still shimmered in the tropical sun. The apsaras still smiled. The gods still watched. But it was not untouched. As Buddhism gradually replaced Hinduism as the dominant faith in the region, Angkor Wat was quietly transformed. Vishnu's images gave way to Buddha's serene face. Monks in orange robes replaced Brahmin priests in white. The rituals changed, but the reverence remained. The temple adapted, a sacred chameleon surviving through the winds of religious evolution. By the 15th century, after Ayutthaya sacked the Angkor region, the imperial city of Angkor Thom was largely abandoned. The jungle surged forward. Trees cracked walls. Vines curled around towers. Monsoons battered courtyards. Wildlife crept into the outer galleries. It would have been easy for the world to forget. But Angkor Wat, miraculously, never vanished. Local Khmer communities continued to worship there, lighting incense at cracked altars and murmuring prayers into worn stone. Buddhist monks took residence and cared for what they could, keeping the pathways clear, whispering mantras into the wind. For generations, the temple lived on not through empires, but through memory. European explorers eventually arrived. In the 16th century, Portuguese missionaries marveled at the scale, calling it the work of giants. By the 19th century, French colonialists rediscovered it, though it had never truly been lost. Angkor Wat became a sensation, a jungle-shrouded masterpiece that defied imagination. Artists, historians, adventurers all flocked to see the temple that had endured where kingdoms had fallen. But their admiration came with disruption. Restoration began, some careful, some careless. In an effort to preserve, others accidentally altered. Still, Angkor Wat endured. Through world wars, civil war, and even the devastating years of the Khmer Rouge it stood. Perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of the story. Not just that the Khmer Empire built it, not just that its towers aligned with the stars, or that its moats tamed rivers, but that Angkor Wat has outlived everything that tried to erase it. Today, tourists tread gently where kings once walked. drones fly where incense once drifted. Yet the awe remains. Stand beneath the spires at dawn, and you feel it, that hum in the stone, that silence heavy with memory. 1,000 years have passed, and still, Angkor Wat speaks. It speaks of vision, the kind that dares to reshape jungles into cities of gods. It speaks of faith, etched in reliefs and whispered in every corridor. It speaks of survival, not just of stone, but of spirit. And so, as the morning light once again kisses the lotus towers, Angkor Wat remains, not as a relic, but as a living monument, a whisper from the past reminding us that even in silence, the greatest stories are never truly forgotten.